Welcome to the second part of my series where I upgrade the components of Eris Games' The War of the Ring. In this video I will be building 3D versions of all 24 strongholds, cities, and ruins found in Middle-earth, and showing you some of the techniques used to create them along the way. In the previous video, the armies were all painted, faction tokens were upgraded, and the 3 rings of power were carved out of super sculpted clay. There's a lot left to get done, so let's get started. When designing these shrunken down Middle-earth landmarks, I planned on breaking them down to mostly simple shapes. The idea of sculpting Minas Tirith may seem daunting, but really is just a bunch of cylinders stacked on top of themselves. Since these are locations made iconic by some of the greatest media of all time, I wanted to make sure they had at least 3 elements of how they commonly look even at this much smaller scale. Even at 2 inches tall, Tower Orthanc will look like it does to most people, as long as it's black, has 4 spikes at the top, and has a balcony for Saruman. Every location was drawn out on a piece of paper to give me the idea of how big it would be, and to try to keep everything to scale. I figured if I could draw it at this size, I could probably sculpt it. For materials, Super Sculpty will be used for the majority of builds. It is a strong and durable clay that can retain fine details, as well as be used with an extruder to pre-make shapes. Chipboard will also be used for areas that need to be flat and not warp, as well as various sizes of dowels. Using chipboard and dowels will keep edges straight and corners sharp. I will also be using Epoxy Sculpt. This is a 2-part compound that will be used to fill in gaps and add additional details, but more on that later. Each stronghold or city will have a basswood base that I cut to be the size of how it's represented on the playing board. Holes are drilled into the bases to allow the clay to adhere better and to keep it from snapping off later. The clay is pressed into the wood base, and I make sure it has been pressed into the drilled holes. Excess is cut away with my clay tools. Natural landforms are gradually built up by layering shapes of clay and blending them together at the seams. I'm starting off with Rivendell and how it's represented in Peter Jackson's movies as a reference. I want an elven castle on top of a mountain and a small arched bridge to pass in front. The clay is pressed and moved around until it creates a shape I want. It is important to try and add texture to areas with open space to make them more interesting. Super Sculpty is a polymer clay that only cures when baked in the oven. It can be baked numerous times, allowing you to work in multiple parts or to preserve details. It can also be used to create shapes. Clay is flattened out and rolled around a socket wrench socket. The stainless steel sockets can be placed in the oven to bake the clay into cylinder shapes. Stacking these shapes and packing them with unbaked clay can hold them together while you sculpt more details or additional parts. Using this method of double baking, I created Rivendell, as well as Dol Guldur, Minas Tirith, Dol Arnamuth, and Mount Gundabar. 5 down, 19 to go. When it came time to build Moria, I knew I wanted to do the west gate, so I could have the elven symbols on the stone. Knowing this could not be painted at this scale, I shrunk down a JPEG of the door and printed it at different sizes. The decal was mounted to a piece of chipboard, and the landform was built around it. Some small tentacles were rolled out with my finger and added at the bottom of the base for the Watcher in the Water. ball of tinfoil can be used to make the clay look like uneven rock formations, and is helpful when sculpting mountains. Everything was then put in the oven. Wait, hang on a second. Okay, we're good. Everything was put in the oven, and this is what came out. Now, with 24 strongholds to make, it's important to choose your battles. If I went all out on every single one, this video would have taken even longer than 5 months to make. That being said, there are some ways to speed up the process. Here I am building the Gondor capital city of Osgiliath with pieces of dowel. The size of the city, and knowing it will be in one of the highest populated parts of the board, I'm not going to kill myself trying to build it. Some different lengths and widths of dowel are cut and glued down with PVA glue. Good enough, moving on. Using dowels along with chipboard is a good way to quickly construct hard geometric shapes. The Golden Hall of Edoras, which is basically just a Viking longhouse, was built using a square dowel and some cardstock dormers. Cardstock was also used to extend the staircase at the bottom of the building. The melting point of PVA glue is lower than the temperature of super sculpting needs to be baked at, so we'll need to use epoxy sculpt since it can air dry. Epoxy sculpt comes in 2 parts and must be mixed together for 3 minutes before it can be used to ensure that it cures correctly. Epoxy sculpt will stick to metal, so it's important to use silicone-tipped tools. This is a cheap set that I got on the internet, but it worked fine. It's also a good idea to have some olive oil nearby. Dipping your tools in oil will keep the epoxy sculpt from building up on them. Epoxy sculpt will stick to the wooden dowels and chipboard easily, and it can be sculpted as it hardens. It was used for a lot of roofs and small details when working with dowels. Just a few more. For some of the strongholds that needed multiple pieces of wood, as well as details that could only be sculpted out of clay, I'd build a foundation of clay on the base and press the pieces of wood down into it. Here's Helm's Deep. Well, actually it's the Hornburg. Helm's Deep is the valley the castle is located in, not the castle itself, but nobody seems to ever get that right. But, you know, that's not a big deal. Still a good game. The wall and square dowel will have the clay built up around them to help lock them in while creating the causeway in front of the gate of the castle. An additional wall and this wooden gatehouse were pushed in behind everything. Clay is built up around these to build the castle's courtyard and connect the 2 pieces of wall. After it was baked in the oven, epoxy sculpt was used to fill in cracks and build a staircase and bridge connecting the walls. Using this technique was also how I created Umbar and Peligre. It can be helpful to create small details to base your builds around. Here I'm making tree branches and roots to work with the construction of the Woodland realms to help break up the repetition of wooden dowels. And here I make some small banners with wire and masking tape to hang off the walls of Far Harad. A series of small clay trees and a wire staircase were used to make Lorien. And what's even easier than making special pieces for builds is stealing pieces from other places. Kit bashing is using parts of model kits for other models that they weren't intended for. I like to keep a box of Spear Warhammer parts and miniature parts for all things like this. When building the Shire, a coil of wire was wrapped up and sent through the base to work as the big tree and bag end. The Hobbit Hill was built up and around a flat piece of chipboard to work as the house's facade, and the tree was sculpted onto the exposed wire. The round front door was taken from a 15mm Flames of War Sherman tank hatch and superglued between toothpicks as support beams. A small piece of 1/8 inch styrene tube was used as a circular window. A few other strongholds were kit bashed around existing parts. The gate at Moria was constructed with a piece of railing and some Skaven spearheads. The Minas Morgul spire is a pen tip, and the details of Erenbor are from 15mm panzer tanks. There's now only one stronghold left, and this is the Fortress of Barad-Dur. This mile-high castle will combine the methods of every stronghold before it in order to complete. I started with a clay ring that would work as the main gate, and pressed 2 dowels into it to work as turrets that would be glued in later. 2 more rings were made, one with a simple vertical line texture, and the second with another opening. The tower part of Barad-Dur was made from a laundry clip that was taken apart, sanded, and glued together backwards. When the glue dried, it was rounded with a Dremel to make the edges less geometric. This clip was still a little too big, so a few centimeters were taken off at the top, and the bottom was squared off to help it stand up. Both ends were sanded. When the clay parts were finished baking, they were stacked onto each other and the clip inside of them. Just like with Minas Tirith, clay is used to lock the rings in place and to make the housing for the tower clip. Everything was then baked again in the oven. The 2 dowel turrets were then glued into place. I liked this metal ring I found on a pen and stole it and placed it on top of the tower as extra detail. Next, using some vintage Skaven spear arms from my Warhammer bit box, I cut the spearheads away and scraped off some of the unwanted detail. The spearheads are superglued to the top of the tower and will be used to hold up the Eye of Sauron. Cracking out the epoxy sculpt, gaps at the bottom are filled in, and points where the rings are uneven are built up to be level again. In Peter Jackson's movies, Barad-Dur looks like it's built into a mountain, and I wanted some of this to carry over into my model, so epoxy sculpt was used to create some rock faces that connected the tower and castle together. Rock face details were pressed into the epoxy sculpt with my silicone tools. After that, the fortifications of the turrets are carved out, and the ends of the spears are continued into the metal pen ring. I felt there was still some more that could be added, so using chipboard and 2 more thinner dowels, this second gatehouse was built into the opening on the smallest clay ring. The gaps between the rock face and the new gatehouse were filled in. The final piece of detail was adding in the Eye of Sauron. I know that this is only in the movie, but it's easily one of the best additions to the story. Epoxy sculpt was pressed between the spearheads, and a cat-like pupil was carved in. And with Barad-Dur complete, it is time to move on to basing and painting. Some dirt from outside and army painter snow mixed together, passed through a sifter, will be used as my basing mixture. White PVA glue is poured into a glass bowl, and using a wet brush, the glue is painted onto the base of the stronghold. Everything is dropped into the basing mixture, and the excess is cleaned up. Painting the glue on gives more control, and that's super important when working at this small size. Areas that needed grass or foliage, I used crushed floral foam as flock. This stuff absorbs the glue and dries super strong, while also giving that clump foliage look. When basing was finished, I primed the models gray, while anything that had flocking dark green, and Lorien was primed red because I wanted the foliage to be yellow when it was done. Painting was similar to how I'd paint any miniature, starting with a base coat, picking out areas with different colors. I used similar neutral colors to keep everything uniform and to keep my tones the same. When I was done base coating, everything was either stained with Agrax Earthshade or Nuln Oil. Then when the stain was dry, using a series of dry brushing and edge highlighting to show more volume on the forms. The pupil of Sauron's eye had to be carefully painted over. Foliage was painted using an airbrush. This was so different colors of green can be added in seamlessly. or in the case of Lorien, yellows. I also use the airbrush on Minas Morgul to give that creepy green glow it has. For strongholds or cities with water, like Dol Amroth, the base was painted blue, and using gloss medium, some waves were pushed around and formed with an old paintbrush. It gave it a cool glossy effect when it dried. This gloss medium can be stained with inks or paint if you wanted to do a different color for water. There were some areas where I had to do multiple layers because I wanted really deep, thick water. Thinner areas dried in about an hour, but some of them where I wanted it thicker took all day to dry. The next step was to paint the edges of the Shadow strongholds or cities red, and the edges of the Alliance strongholds cities blue. The very last thing I did was, in case I was ever in an accident and forgot my Lord of the Rings knowledge, I printed out the names of each stronghold or city, cut them out, and glued them to the bottom of each base. Finally, all 24 Middle-earth landmarks are completed and can be shown off. These 3D strongholds and cities add an immense amount of board presence and scale to an already epic game. Some are clearly better than others, but altogether they create a vast and developing Middle-earth worth fighting over. This was a huge step forward in completing all of our upgrades, but there's still much more to be done. In the next video, I'll be building all of Tolkien's mountain ranges, as well as doing something with that Mount Doom track. So make sure you come back and check it out. Legolas, what your elf eyes see